do another quick tutorial straight after the last idiot's guide on controlling the light, because that was pretty basic really, and I thought I'd do something on those first few steps away from the auto, or away from fully auto really, because you still spend most of your time, I think, with your camera in various auto settings, and this is sort of my little guide really as to those first baby steps away from that towards manual and towards you controlling the camera rather than the camera controlling you. Now, the full auto setting on your camera is where a lot of people stay. Then there are 4 others that you will see on your little ring controller dial. P is program mode, which I use quite a bit, and I'll come on to that later. S is shutter priority, where you determine the shutter speed. You control whether you're going to shoot at 1/10 of a second, slow shutter speed, or 1,000th of a second, 10 seconds, whatever. You control the shutter speed, and the camera adjusts the aperture to let the right amount of light in for that shutter speed. Okay, so it's still automatic to a point, but you're controlling the starting point of it. Then there's the A is aperture priority, and I do understand these are different with Canon cameras, but that's up to you Canon owners to sort out between you. Choosing bizarre letters for aperture and shutter speed, that's not my problem. Right, it's A, aperture priority, where you choose the aperture, you decide what aperture you want to shoot with, and the camera will then adjust the shutter speed automatically to suit that aperture. So again, it's automatic really, but you're choosing the starting point, and then the camera is adjusting, it's following you. And then M is manual, where you control both the shutter speed and the aperture. So you're in complete control then. And if you know what you're doing, that's fine, but don't venture into that and blunder about blindly, because you will get completely lost, completely confused, end up throwing the camera in the bin. I've seen people do that, literally. Okay. Now, how do you decide between aperture priority and shutter priority? What thought processes might go through your mind when you're thinking, now I'm going to shoot that, now what's the best setting for my camera, how shall I approach that? Now I have a sort of a fairly simple mantra really, which generally holds true. Now I don't want people to start getting nitpicky with it, because I think it generally does hold true. There's very few hard and fast rules, so it's easy to pick holes in anything, but as a general rule, my mantra for which camera mode to use would be, think about the photo you want to take. Now, is movement a big issue in that photo that you're taking? If movement is a big issue, either stopping fast moving things or capturing slow moving things, or say the movement of capturing moving lights, like light trails at night, traffic moving through a nighttime street, and you want to capture the lights, correct light trails. Those things. If movement is your main priority, your main interest in that photo, then I would go into shutter priority, or I'd at least be thinking of the shutter speed first. Okay. If depth of field is your major priority in that photo, and you want either a very, we'll come on to this later to what it actually means, but yeah, you want sharp focus on a particular piece of that photo, and you want everything else in front and behind blurred, that's the depth of field. You want a very narrow depth of field, so only a tiny bit of that photo is in focus and sort of stands out almost in 3D from everything else. If that's your priority, depth of field, then use aperture priority. You think of the aperture first. And the same actually applies if you want the opposite to a shallow depth of field. If you want a really broad depth of field, you want everything in the image to be in focus. So you're doing a landscape, and you want a tree close to you, and you want the trees in the background, or the lake, or the hills. You want everything, as much as possible, near and far, in focus. And you want a very broad depth of field. Then again, think about the aperture first, because the aperture is what controls that depth of field. Okay? So that's, if you can get that in your head, that's a start. That's how I would start people to move away from the automatic settings, to start you controlling this piece of kit, not the other way around. Okay? So if movement is your big thing, like you're doing at a sporting event, people moving around very fast, racing cars, cyclists, then fast shutter speed to capture that motion, otherwise you just get a blurred, messy image. So that's shutter priority for movement, okay? And even if it's slow movement you want, even if you want to blur waterfalls, blur the water in a waterfall or the sea, those sorts of misty, silky effects you can get. You see a lot of those waterfalls. That's a slow shutter speed that does that. So a shutter priority. Movement, if movement is your thing in that image, shutter priority. Or think of the shutter speed first. If it's depth of field that you're interested in, if you want everything in focus, you want every single thing to be as sharp as possible, or you want to focus in on a little object, have a very shallow depth of field to make that object really pop out of the image, make it look 3D, then depth of field, aperture priority. Think of the aperture first. Okay? If you can get those two silly little concepts into your head, that will help you get away from the automatic setting. Okay? And I'll put up some photos to illustrate what I'm talking about, to sort of intersperse it as I'm talking about, describing it, so it makes more sense. But I think this is really important as the first baby steps for you getting away from the auto settings, just drifting in, getting a little bit more in control, a little bit more confident, and you deciding what you're going to shoot. Okay, there are lots of different things you can do once you start controlling the shutter speed. You might deliberately want to blur movement, or you might want it really crisp and really sharp. Water is a fantastic thing to illustrate both extremes, but the same applies to kids running around and playing, footballers, racing cars, whatever. You can go either way. You can blur it to create an impression of the movement, and that'll be a slower shutter speed, or you can freeze it and freeze the expressions and really get in there and see every detail, and that's a fast shutter speed. But either way, movement, shutter speed. And if you want the depth of field, either everything in focus or a little fraction of the image in focus, that's depth of field, then think about the aperture first. Okay? That will get you started on your journey away from the auto settings and into creativity. Okay? We'll touch on those a lot more in the future. That's the start.